host, and do not necessarily reflect the views of CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, CNN, or MSNBC, or Al Jazeera, or anyone else that you can imagine.
Hello, Americans. This is
Scott Clark.
Stand by for news.
With the Heidelcast, the broadcast devoted to recovering Reformed theology, piety, and practice.
What are we talking about? We're talking about practice. Not a game, not a game, not a game. We're talking about practice.
I'm a pastor and a church historian. This is episode 87 for the week of Sunday, March 1, 2015. The Heidelcast is a service of heidelblog.net. Contact the Heidelcast at heidelblog.net or on Twitter at @RScottClark. Send us a message, and we may use it in a future broadcast. Catch all the episodes at heidelblog.net or in another podcast app such as Podcruncher. Click on the Heidelcast icon on the HB homepage to get all of the information.
Guess what? I got a fever, and the only prescription is more cowbell.
You keep asking, and I keep delivering. This is part 9 of our series on the moral law. You can start this series in episode 77. In the first commandment, we saw that the Lord will not share his glory with another. In the second, that we must worship the true God truly, only in the way that he has commanded. In the third, we learn how to revere God and his name as holy. In the fourth, we're commanded to set aside one day in 7 for rest, worship, and works of mercy. In the fifth, how to submit to and honor divinely instituted authorities and what limits those authorities live and work and serve under. According to the sixth commandment, we are to refrain from murder with our hands, our mouths, and our hearts. And we are to seek our neighbor's well-being. After the last episode, it occurred to me that there was an obvious question that I should have addressed under the sixth commandment, hence part 2. And that question is abortion, the termination of a human life in the womb. Since 1973, no fewer than 50 million human beings have lost their lives to abortion. Yes, you heard me correctly. That's 50 million. That's not an exaggerated number. Even Politifact agrees. 50 million. That's more than the population of California, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Kansas combined. Imagine 4 American states utterly vacant of human life. And that's what we've done, voluntarily, since 1973. Since that time, Americans have killed more people in the womb than were killed in all of World War II. It's a widespread practice. In fact, it's so widespread that many people don't even question its legitimacy. It's widespread, it's widely accepted, but is it right? Or is it murder, a violation of the sixth commandment, a violation of God's holy moral law, the universal moral law, that same natural law that is expressed in creation and that is written on the conscience of every human being in every time and place and culture? Sometimes when concerns are expressed about abortion, it's made to seem as if it's some sort of fundamentalist crusade or some sort of fascist operation to squash freedom. Well, one need not be a fundamentalist Christian to oppose abortion, if only because there are people who have opposed abortion who are neither fundamentalist nor Christian. Throughout human history, even pagans have sought to make the killing of human life in the womb illegal, at least some of the time. According to J. Ryan Davidson in an encyclopedia entry summarizing the work of several others, and here I'm quoting, the Middle Assyrian laws, which date as far back as the early 11th century BC, specifically addressed abortion. And he adds, originally, the Roman Republic legally allowed abortion. These were chemical abortions. These were mixtures that people concocted with the intent of killing the baby by ingesting something. However, he adds, that stance may have changed around Cicero's time because the empire needed more citizens. So the report from the ancient pagans is somewhat mixed, but certainly there were pagans who prohibited the killing of unborn human beings. The report among ancient Christians is fairly consistent. In the Treatise to Diognetus from the middle of the 2nd century, chapter 5 says, quoting now, describing Christians as distinct from pagans and Jews, quoting, "They marry, as do all others. They beget children, but they do not cast away their fetuses. And that's a literal translation of that line from chapter 5 of the treatise, or sometimes the letter to Diognetus. That expression, cast away their fetuses, is ambiguous. Some take it to refer to abortion, others to leaving a child to die of exposure, which is how one contemporary translation has it. Even if it refers to leaving a child out to die of exposure, it seems odd to imagine that this early Christian would oppose infanticide, that is, killing a child outside of the womb, postpartum, but then to imagine that he would permit it in utero. That the author used the noun fetus, or foetus in Latin, or fetus as we've Englished it, may suggest that in fact he was thinking of an unborn child, since that is how that noun is often used. And this might be a good time to talk about vocabulary. In the discussion of abortion, the noun fetus, which has become an English word, is often used, but the noun foetus, F-O-E-T-U-S, which has become fetus, is often used for a pre-born human infant. In our culture, though, and this is something of which you need to be aware, the noun fetus is often used, and the adjective fetal is often used, to create some distance between the preborn human and his humanity. In other words, if we use a technical-sounding Latin term, people won't realize that we're talking about human beings that just haven't emerged from the womb yet. But that's all that fetus means. It doesn't mean any less than that. In other words, there's nothing inherent about the noun fetus or the adjective fetal to suggest in some scientific way or some technical way that what we're talking about is less than human. In the Didache, which is actually a little earlier than the treatise to Diognetus, it's an early 2nd century or possibly late 1st century church order, but certainly no one would contest an early 2nd century date as too early. In chapter 2, it describes abortion as a violation of God's law. And I quote, "And the second commandment of the teaching of the Didache," not referring to the Decalogue, "you shall not commit murder," which is in the Decalogue, quoting again, "you shall not commit adultery, you shall not commit pederasty," which is sexual attraction or sexual activity with children, minors. "You shall not commit fornication," which is general sexual immorality. "You shall not steal. You shall not practice magic. You shall not practice witchcraft." And here it comes. "You shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill that which is born." In other words, you may not kill a child in utero, in the womb, and you may not kill a child after he's born. And then it goes on to say, "You shall not covet the things of your neighbor. You shall not swear. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not speak evil. You shall bear no grudge. You shall not be double-minded or double-tongued." And it goes on. So clearly here, the Didache is working with the Decalogue and applying the Decalogue to particular cases that were faced by early Christians in the 2nd century. And again, it says, "You shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill that which is born." So both abortion, that is killing a child in the womb, and infanticide, as if there's a difference, that is killing a child out of the womb, are both forbidden in the early 2nd century. And here, the Christian view of humanity is distinguished from the pagan Roman view, which is rather more utilitarian. For the Christians, human beings have intrinsic value, and therefore their life is to be protected. The 3rd century father Tertullian, who's the father of Latin theology, wrote in his Apology in chapter 9, "In our case," he says, "murder being once for all forbidden," here it comes, "we may not destroy even the fetus in the womb," that is, even the unborn child, "while as yet," he says, "the human being derives blood from other parts of the body for its sustenance. To hinder a birth is merely a speedier man-killing, nor does it matter whether you take away a life that is born or destroy one that is coming to the birth." Notice that he explicitly described abortion as murder. Athenagoras, a Christian apologist writing in the late 2nd century, about 177 AD, distinguished between the behavior of the Christians and that of the pagans. And again, I quote, "And we say that those women who use drugs to bring on abortion commit murder, and we will have to give an account to God for the abortion. On what principle should we commit murder? For it does not belong to the same person to regard the very fetus in the womb as a created being and therefore an object of God's care, and when it has passed into life, to kill it, and not to expose an infant, because those who expose them are chargeable with child murder, and, on the other hand, when it has been reared, to destroy it. But in all things, always alike and the same, submitting ourselves to reason and not ruling over it. So again, Athenagoras very clearly reflecting the broad, widespread Christian consensus in the 2nd century that abortion is murder. So we have testimony from Diognetus in Greek, authorship of which is debated, but possibly anyway authored by Polycarp, who has connections to the Apostle John. We have testimony from the father of Latin theology, Tertullian, and we have testimony from a notable Alexandrian theologian. So all across the Christian world in the 2nd century, abortion is regarded as murder. The consensus position of the fathers, the early fathers, was reaffirmed in the early medieval church by the Council of Trullo in 692 in Constantinople. Canon 91 of the Council of Trullo says, "Those who give drugs for procuring abortion and those who receive poisons to kill the fetus are subjected to the penalty of murder." And the ancient epitome or summary of Canon 91 elaborates on this moral teaching to the same effect, but adding that abortion is a sin not only because it murders an infant human in the womb, in utero, but also because it jeopardizes the life of the mother, whose life is also sacred. The history of Christian teaching about abortion is pretty clear, but it does seem that sometime in the modern period, we lost our bearings. And it's not entirely clear to me how and when that was, but the truth is, if you go back and look at how even the most conservative Christians reacted to the abortion discussion in the late 60s and early 70s, and even after Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton, the seminal legal cases at the Supreme Court in 1973, it's clear that Christians had not thought about this well or carefully for some time, and we were caught flat-footed. And so I asked myself, why was that? How did that come to be? And one reason for that flat-footedness may have been our fuzziness about another issue. So let me ask you a question. What do you think about British and American businessmen sailing to the west coast of Africa, stealing people by the millions, by some estimates 10 million or more, enslaving them to work on plantations in America, destroying families, literally raping women, separating husbands and wives, parents from children, buying and selling human beings as if they were cattle? What, you say you're against that? Okay. Many Americans, many of whom regarded themselves as devout, Bible-believing Christians, got into the habit of saying that some people are not as fully human as others, and on that basis justified the buying and selling and separating and enslaving and sometimes torturing other human beings. We did that. We Christians did that. In fact, it wasn't that many years ago that two leading proponents of the federal vision theology published a notorious booklet, chunks of which were plagiarized from another book defending the propriety and the benefits of man-stealing and chattel slavery. And remarkably, these folks are still regarded as leading Christian teachers and embraced by other leading Christian evangelical teachers. So many Americans who regarded themselves as devout Christians, got into the habit of saying that some people are not as fully human as others, not as intelligent, not as apt, not as aware, and not as worthy of those natural liberties that they took as God-given life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so it wasn't a big step from denying the humanity of an entire continent of people to denying the humanity of infants in the womb in the 20th century. After all, after slavery ended in this country, ostensibly Christian people imposed Jim Crow laws, again on the basis that, in part, and justified them in part on the basis that those against whom these laws were written were not fully human, didn't have the same capacity intellectually, emotionally, etc. All of which we know now, and which reasonable people have known forever to have been complete rubbish and nonsense. There were ostensibly Christian people who supported eugenics, the theory and practice of weeding out allegedly inferior people. The founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, was not only a racist, she spoke to a rally of the Ku Klux Klan, but she was a pioneer in the field of eugenics, that is, the attempt to purify the genetic pool of the human race with the intent of producing an allegedly superior race of people. If that sounds familiar to you, it should. It was the theory of the Nazi Party in Germany before and during World War II. They declared the mythical Aryan race to be superior and proceeded to attempt to wipe out all other allegedly, ostensibly inferior races. And that's why there was a Holocaust in which more than 6 million people were murdered during World War II. What if I told you that some of the very same arguments used to justify stealing and enslaving Africans are still being used, this time to justify aborting the life of human beings in the uterus? The number one argument in my experience when I talk to people about abortion, the number one argument used by those to justify abortion when I talk about this with them is the very same argument that was used to justify the stealing and enslaving of Africans. And that argument is that they were not fully human. I think the slavers knew that if they conceded that Africans were fully human and bearers of the image of God, then it would have been much more difficult to justify what they were doing. Every argument that seeks to justify abortion seeks in some way or other to deny the humanity of people in the womb. Walk into a Planned Parenthood clinic. Now, this is just a thought experiment. I'm not encouraging you to do this, but if were you to do this, and I've had conversations with people like this, not in that setting, if you were to walk into a Planned Parenthood clinic, now this is a thought experiment, don't anybody panic, and if you were to sit down and to have a polite, civil conversation about abortion, and were you to ask the proponents at Planned Parenthood why they think it's okay to perform abortions in women whose lives are not in imminent danger, who are otherwise healthy, the answer would be because it's a woman's choice to end a pregnancy. Well, why is it a woman's choice to end a pregnancy? What's implied in that assertion of the autonomy of the woman over her pregnancy? Well, the rhetoric is it's her body. Well, yes, it is her body. It is going on in her, but there are two people involved. There's a little tiny human being that's developing in the body of that woman. Is it a woman's choice to fly to Africa, steal some people, and enslave them? No, you say? Why not? Because Africans are human beings created in the image of God, and they have a natural right to live in peace, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, if that's true for adult humans, why aren't infants in utero, infants in the womb, why aren't they guaranteed those same rights? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The only way one can logically defend the termination of a human life in utero is to suggest that life is not fully and truly human. It's interesting. The abortionist says that infants are human when we want to keep them, but they are subhuman when we don't. That is the definition of incoherence. In what other case does the humanity of a person depend on the decision of another? Even when we put criminals to death, we recognize their humanity, and therefore we seek to put them to death, murderers, humanely. In fact, we've so tied ourselves up in knots as to how to do it humanely that it's become almost impossible to do it, because we're running out of apparently the drugs needed to put people to death humanely. Utah's apparently talking about bringing back firing squads. So it's interesting. We're worried about treating criminals humanely, but infants, because they're unable to speak and unable to defend themselves, are sometimes regarded as human and sometimes not. And sometimes at the very same stage of development. So we're not even talking about the artificial trimester divisions imposed by the Supreme Court in 1973. In what other case does one's humanity depend on the decision of another? Are we going to deny the status of human or image bearer to senior citizens when they're too old and infirm to defend themselves? We'll say they're too much bother, they're too dependent, and so we'll just declare them no longer human. If we can withhold the status of image bearer and human being from infants in utero, why not take it away from senior citizens? Why not? It's true that human beings are conceived and grow inside of a woman. But that fact does not make that developing human being within the womb of the woman a mere appendage to be removed at the woman's convenience. What is conceived within a human being and by the act of two human beings is human. After all, think about that. What else could human beings possibly conceive but another human being? And yet we tell these lies to ourselves to make what we want to do seem plausible. But in the middle of the night, I submit to you that those who do these things or have done these things would tell you that they know that it's not true. What does Scripture say? Genesis 1:27, so God created man, that is humanity, in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. The first human beings and all human beings subsequent to them were bearers of the divine image. They had dignity, inherent dignity and worth, because they reflect their Creator. They were made with an intent, with design, with purpose by their Creator. And we confess in the Reformed confession that they were made in righteousness and true holiness, that they might rightly know God, their Creator, heartily love Him, and live with Him in eternal blessedness. They were made with the ability to obey His law. They were made good. And when Adam and Eve procreated, they created within Eve Cain and Abel. Those are human beings. And when Cain murdered Abel, he was liable for his crime of murder because of the intrinsic value of Abel's life as an image bearer. When did Abel become an image bearer? Was it when he was 4 years old, as a Princeton ethicist suggests, that children who are less than 4 years are still subject to being put to death? And you think I'm kidding, and I'm not. That's a serious proposal. That's nothing but infanticide. When Cain and Abel were conceived, they were human beings. We begin as tiny little human beings. That's it. You can give them all the technical names that you want, but they're still tiny little human beings. It's not as if we begin as something else and then become human. We begin as humans, and if we don't make it out of the womb naturally, let's say something happens and a child dies in the womb, mothers and fathers grieve. Why do they grieve? Because they lost a child. And that's a sad thing. And that child was made in the image of God. We are never anything less than human at any point. When we deny the humanity of others, we are really attacking the God in whose image we were created. And we know this from Genesis chapter 9, as we saw last time. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." That's 9:1. "The fear of you and the dread of you will be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your life blood I will require a reckoning from every beast. I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." Genesis 9 intentionally and clearly distinguishes between human and non-human life. We are free to eat and kill animals and plants because they're not human. They're not made in the image of God. Your dog and your cat are pets. I love dogs, I love cats, but those pets are not your children. But anyone who takes the life of a human unjustly is subject to capital punishment for a capital crime. Now, don't misunderstand me. I think people who abuse animals are evil and should be punished harshly. The point I want to make here is that there is a distinction between humans and other creatures. And Genesis 9 links the image of God to human beings, and specifically, I want you to notice that it links the image of God to human flesh and blood, to our bodies. The image is not something that is purely ethereal or something that sets in gradually over time when somebody at some point decides, well, I guess you are an image bearer. No, human beings are, from the moment of conception, image bearers. So the image is in us, that's true, but it's also the case that we are the image. And it's not the case that, let's say, in an industrial or farming accident, somebody loses an arm, that somehow they're less the image. That's not the point. The point is that we can't artificially assign the image to some ethereal quality. We are body and soul, and all of that goes into being image bearers. And that's one reason why there will be a bodily resurrection. We were made to be body and soul. The body is an essential part of who we are. And there are a few other passages we should consider. The psalmist in Psalm 139:14 says that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, that we were knit together in the womb. It never occurred to the psalmist that human beings conceive something subhuman that becomes human. We were fearfully and wonderfully made. We didn't become fearfully and wonderfully made when somebody decided that we were. No, we were. John the Baptist leapt in his mother's womb. That's a human behavior. He's an image bearer. And so now I want to say something that may sound harsh, but it needs to be said and you need to hear it. Honestly, the idea that we confer and remove humanity from people is just a couple of degrees away from being sociopathic. That's what sociopaths do. That's what mass murderers do. Psychiatrists and psychologists who've interviewed sociopaths will tell you that they don't see their victims as truly human. They're not able to empathize with other people. They're able to murder people and sleep well at night because they don't see others as equally valuable, as sacred, as human. When we declare about infants in the womb who may be very tiny or who may be almost fully developed and ready to be born, when we deny them their status as image bearers and full and true human beings, it's hard to see how that is not verging on a sort of sociopathic thinking. If you were born after 1973, after those famous court cases, Supreme Court cases, Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton, Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton, you might think that the way things are now is the way they've always been, but you should not think that way. The idea that we may kill another human being at any point within the womb, and that's the consequence of those two cases, that we may kill another human being at any point within the womb. Yes, even in the third trimester, or even in some cases as we are emerging from the womb. That's a relative novelty. Even pagans knew it was wrong. None of them would have permitted a physician to take a pair of scissors and jab them in the back of the neck of an infant as he's emerging from the womb. What happened in the Gosnell case in Philadelphia, and if you don't know what that is, then look it up. Gosnell, Gosnell, the Gosnell case in Philadelphia. What happened there just a few years ago was not an accident. There are physicians in the United States performing late-term abortions. I mean, if you're surprised, it may be because the popular media frequently misrepresents what happened in those court cases in 1973. According to Clark Forsyth and other scholars, those two cases make it possible to end the life of an unborn child at any time for virtually any reason. These decisions have been in the law of the land for more than 40 years, and so it's easy to simply accept the status quo as if it were normal, but it's not normal. Killing 50 million people is never normal. But because so many people have done it, you probably know someone who has had an abortion, or maybe you have had one yourself. Well, what now? Well, first of all, Christians ought to be defenders of the weak and defenseless. Unborn humans are quintessentially weak and defenseless image bearers, and they are our neighbors. And I talked about that in the previous episode. Maybe the most effective thing we can do is to seek to turn the tide, and I do have some hope that at least culturally, socially, the tide is turning. Not so much by protesting or shouting, and I've done some protesting in front of clinics and hospitals and the like, and I'm not saying there's no value in there. I think there's some value in making a public statement that there are people in this world who are willing to stand up and say, hey, what's happening in this place is wrong. But there may be even more value in persuading our neighbors, our friends, and our coworkers in quiet, civil, gracious, patient conversations. I'm not saying this would be easy, because there are millions of people who have a need to justify in their own minds that what they did was right. And that's the genius of the Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton cases. If you ask Roe and Bolton today, however, if the truth was told in 1973, you might be surprised at what they would say. What they have said, you can look it up. We were sold a bill of goods back in 73, and millions of people today are implicated in abortion, and therefore there are a lot of people who have a temptation or a need to defend the status quo. Otherwise, they would have to admit that we were all duped and we made a horrendous decision, and millions of people have been implicated in murder. And here we can learn from how the West generally, and Germany perhaps in particular, reacted to the Holocaust. Most of us in the West came to admit that the Holocaust was made possible because of lies about Jews and Gypsies and Africans and many others. After the war, we accepted responsibility for looking the other way. And generally, as a culture, we said, never again. Just because we made a mistake in 1973 in those two court cases doesn't mean that we are forever stuck with them. We ended slavery. We admitted that we were wrong. We ended separate but equal. We admitted that we were wrong. We can end abortion on demand, but it will only come when we each and all admit that human beings conceive, bear, and give birth to human beings, and that humans are inherently worthy of protection as bearers of the divine image. And for those who've had them, abortion is sin, that's right, but it's not the unforgivable sin. Men and women who've been involved in abortion in whatever way can find forgiveness in Jesus Christ. Acknowledge your sin, repent, trust Christ for your righteousness, accept his forgiveness freely given, and remember, he forgave his murderers. He forgives you, and you turn in true faith.
Good night, Jeff. And from Washington, thank you, and good night for all of us at NBC News.
Tune in next week,
where we will turn to part 10 of our series on God's holy law, and we'll consider the seventh commandment. Subscribe at heidelblog.net in iTunes or your podcast app. Write to Heidelcast at heidelblog.net or on Twitter at rscottclark. Send us a message, and we may use it in a future broadcast. Remember, the Heidelcast may be cheap, but it isn't free. When the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks.
Copyright 2015. All rights reserved.